The year 2001. The beginning of the 21st century. 10 years have passed since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The world has changed. In Afghanistan, the Taliban have now taken power and controls most parts of the country. Ahmad Shah Massoud was one of Afghanistan's leading commanders against Soviet occupation between 1979 and 1989. After the Taliban conquered, he led anti-Taliban forces in northern Afghanistan and prevented the occupation of Panjshir. On September 9, 2001, Ahmad Shah Massoud was finally killed in a suicide bombing by two terrorist men who had identified themselves as journalists and suspected of collaborating with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is an extremist Islamic terrorist organization of multinational Sunni militants consisting of Salafi jihadists. The network was founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden and several other Arab volunteers during the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden arrived in Jalalabad on a private plane a year after the Taliban was established and was welcomed by Taliban officials. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 Al-Qaeda members hijacked 4 commercial passenger planes. The hijackers deliberately flew 2 planes at different intervals to the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. As a result of these 2 collisions, all the passengers were killed along with many people who were present in the buildings. Both buildings were completely destroyed after 2 hours and caused a lot of damage to the surrounding buildings. The hijacker group shot the 3rd plane to the Pentagon, located in Arlington, Virginia. The 4th plane was shot down on a land near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The United States has blamed Al-Qaeda, led by bin Laden, and asked the Taliban to hand him over to the United States as soon as possible, but the Taliban refused to hand over Osama bin Laden to the United States. With the 9/11 attacks and bin Laden's failure to surrender to the United States by the Taliban, the attack on Afghanistan was on the U.S. agenda. The United States invaded Afghanistan on October 7, 2001. With the cooperation of members of the opposition front of the Taliban, former Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, the Taliban group was defeated and Hamid Karzai became the president of Afghanistan. In December 2001, the UN Security Council established the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, to oversee military operations in the country and train Afghan national security forces. In East Asia, East Timor, which was one of Indonesia's provinces until 2002, seceded following an independent uprising and riots, and on May 20, 2002, East Timor finally declared independence from Indonesia. In February 2003, a major armed conflict broke out in the Darfur area of Sudan. It was a war launched by the Sudanese Liberation Movement and the Justice and Equality Movement against the Sudanese government on charges of suppressing the Darfur non-Arab population. The government responded to the attacks by conducting an ethnic cleansing campaign against non-Arabs in Darfur. This resulted in the killing of hundreds of thousands of civilians and the indictment of the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, for genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. In August 2003, NATO entered the Afghan conflict as an ally and took the helm of the ISAF. Some U.S. troops in Afghanistan operated under NATO command, and others were under direct U.S. command. Taliban leader Mullah Omar reorganized the movement and in 2002 launched a revolt against the government and the ISAF. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist government has lasted since 1979. In 2003, Saddam was seen by the Americans as a threat to allies and a threat to the Persian Gulf oil shipments and the stability of the Middle East. In his statement to Congress in 2002, U.S. President George W. Bush spoke of the axis of evil, which he considers to be Iran, Iraq and North Korea. He also suggested that he would use force to overthrow the Iraqi government. The Iraqi regime has been pursuing a plan to produce nerve agent and nuclear weapons for a decade, he said. Iraq continues to show its enmity to the United States and support the terrorism, he said. George W. Bush offered 2 main justifications for launching an invasion of Iraq. One was Saddam Hussein's relationship with Al-Qaeda and the other was the destruction of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction under the 1991 agreement. The coalition armed forces were ordered to operate and the United States invaded Iraq. The Iraqi government and army were destroyed 3 weeks after the US and its allies invaded. The United States tried to kill Saddam with airstrikes at least twice, but both times were not targeted. At the beginning of April, coalition forces occupied a large part of Iraq. The very weak resistance of the Iraqi army either broke easily or turned into guerrilla tactics. This situation indicated the departure of control from Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was arrested on December 13, 2003 by U.S. forces while hiding in a basement in a yard in a village near his hometown. Saddam Hussein was handed over to the interim Iraqi government on June 30, 2004, to be tried on charges of war crimes, inhumane crimes and massacres. During this trial, special attention was paid to his brutal activities against the Kurds in northern Iraq during the war with Iran and against the southern Shiites between 1991 and 1999. Coalition forces saw a gradual increase in attacks on their forces in various areas after Bush's speech on the success of the U.S. operation, especially in the Sunni Triangle. The Iraqi army and the Presidential Special Guard had set up hundreds of ammunition depots before the U.S. invasion. The first Iraqi insurgents were fed from these warehouses. The first resistance was created by loyalists to the Ba'ath Party, but soon the religious extremists and Iraqis who were angry with the occupation of their country rose to the resistance. In 2004, one of these Sunni jihadist groups pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden and became al-Qaeda in Iraq. In Baghdad, Anbar and Salahuddin provinces, more than other provinces witnessed attacks by insurgents and extremist Sunnis and al-Qaeda militias led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Although these provinces make up only 35% of Iraq's population, they were responsible for 73% of American soldiers' killings. The Shiites, led by the young cleric, Muqtada al-Sadr, also staged political protests and formed Jaish al-Mahdi militias, which operated in the southern regions of Iraq, Najaf, Basra, Kufa, and around Baghdad, the town of Sadr, and the Shiite areas. The coalition countries, along with the United Nations, sought to form a democratic government capable of defending itself against non-coalition forces as well as internal separatists. On March 11, 2004, in Madrid, Spain, saboteurs allegedly affiliated with al-Qaeda and the Maghreb jihadist movement killed 191 innocent passengers by bombing 5 city trains connecting the Madrid suburbs to the capital. More than 400 people were injured in the bombing. The terrorists, a group of whom committed suicide in the following days in a clash with the police, by blowing up the house in which they were hiding, claimed in their statements that they had committed such a crime in protest of the Spanish military presence in Iraq. In Ukraine, the Orange Revolution took place, a series of rallies, sit-ins, strikes, and civil disobediences that took place from November 2004 to January 2005. Immediately after the election in 2004, it was claimed that widespread corruption, intimidation, threats, and direct fraud had taken place. On July 7, 2005 in London, England, 4 terrorists individually blew up 3 improvised explosive devices into London subway trains across the city and then the 4th bomb on a double-decker bus. In addition to the bombers, 52 British nationals of 18 different nationalities were killed and more than 700 people were injured in the attacks. This was the first Islamic suicide attack in this country. Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for the London attacks. The Israeli-Lebanese War, or the 33-Day War, was a 33-day war between the Israeli army and Hezbollah in Lebanon, covering northern Israel and all of Lebanon. Tel Aviv rejected the Lebanese Hezbollah's repeated requests that Israel did not adhere to the agreement in 2004 for the release of Lebanese prisoners in Israel. On July 12, 2006, Lebanese Hezbollah forces entered Israeli territory and attacked a group of Israeli ground forces, killing 3 and capturing 2 Israeli soldiers and transferring them to Lebanese territory. The Israeli Air Force carried out attacks on Lebanese infrastructure, such as roads, bridges and Beirut Airport, during which several Lebanese citizens were killed. On November 5, 2006, Saddam Hussein was sentenced to death with a gallows, and finally hanged in Baghdad on December 30, 2006, coinciding with Eid al-Adha. In 2006, the Taliban once again declared their existence and opposed the rule of Afghanistan, infiltrating most parts of southern Afghanistan, especially Zabul, Kandahar and Helmand, and after 2 years began to advance towards the capital. The Pakistani Taliban also entered into an armed struggle in 2007 with the aim of establishing an Islamic government and enforcing Sharia law in Pakistan. In the absence of the Afghan army, these forces were able to gradually build weapons and ammunition factories for themselves. In June 2007, after clashes between the Palestinian groups Fatah and Hamas, Hamas was able to dominate the Gaza Strip. The conflict began with Hamas' victory in the 2006 parliamentary elections. At noon on May 5, 2007, it became an armed conflict and culminated in Gaza from July 7 to 14, 2007. Which ended during the Battle of Gaza in 2007 with the success of Hamas and the occupation of the security organizations of the Palestinian National Government. Since then, Palestine has been divided into two separate states in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. A year later, the Israeli-Hamas battle in Gaza began shortly after the end of the 6-month agreement between Israel and Hamas and 12 militant groups. The Siege of Gaza, which began in 2007 following the victory of Hamas in the elections and the defeat of the Fatah movement and the Egyptian-Israeli security agreement, intensified in 2008 with the continuation of sporadic clashes between Israel and Hamas. On February 17, 2008, the Kosovo parliament passed the Declaration of Independence and Separation of the province from Serbia, declaring Kosovo an independent, democratic and ruling state. The United States will continue to work with its allies to ensure that violence does not occur in Kosovo, said U.S. President Bush. Serbia opposes Kosovo's independence and considers the area to be part of its territory as the autonomous province of Kosovo and Metohija. In Belgrade, Serbian Prime Minister called Kosovo a false country in a televised speech. He said the emergence of independence for Kosovo was a violation of international standards. Russia, an ally of Serbia, has previously said it is calling for immediate consultations in the UN Security Council. Belgrade and Moscow both argue that Kosovo's independence could lead to separatist movements in other parts of Europe. After years of political conflict between Russia and Georgia and Russian intervention, Georgia began to suppress the independence of South Ossetia, but a ceasefire was declared. Following the announcement of the ceasefire, on August 7, 2008, Georgian army forces captured the city of Tskinvali in a surprise operation, which led to a military conflict between Russia and Georgia. The next day, on August 8, 2008, Russia placed part of its forces on the border with Ossetia in response to the Georgian army's attack. Russian tanks then entered the city of Tskinvali. Dmitry Medvedev, the then president of Russia, described Russia's move to defend Russian citizens living in South Ossetia. Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili announced, Georgia will defend itself against Russian attacks. Georgia also said Russian warplanes had bombed Tbilisi International Airport. Russia also sent warships to the ports of Georgia on the shores of the Black Sea. 4 Russian officers were also arrested by Georgia. Russia and Nicaragua recognized the independence of South Ossetia on August 26 and September 3, 2008, respectively, after the victory of the independence. But NATO members, the European Union and most other countries consider it part of Georgia. On the other hand, the land of Abkhazia separated from Georgia in the war that occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992 and 1993, and officially declared its autonomy in 1999. An action that made Abkhaz region face international sanctions. The Abkhazian authorities finally declared independence in 2008, using the space created after the invasion of South Ossetia by the Georgian army and Russia's intervention in support of South Ossetia's independence. Georgian authorities consider South Ossetia a territory occupied by Russians. On the other hand, there are rumors about the possible joining of South Ossetia to the Russian Federation. In January 2009, in the United States, Barack Obama was elected as the 44th President of the United States. In 2009 in Iran, following the announcement of the results of the 10th presidential election and the announcement of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's re-victory, the result of the election was widely protested by the supporters of Mohsen Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi and was called a coup by some political analysts. First, a demonstration was started in Tehran and some other cities of Iran by thousands of protesters. These protests were met with heavy repression by anti-riot police forces and militia supporters of the government in Sepah and Basij, so that its intensity has been unprecedented in Tehran in the last decade. From 2010 to 2012, the Arab Spring took place. An unprecedented series of uprisings, marches and protests in the predominantly Arab countries of North Africa and Southwest Asia. During these uprisings, rulers were overthrown in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. In Tunisia, President Zine Al Abidine bin Ali was ousted, accused and deported, and the government was overthrown. In Egypt, President Hosni Mubarak was ousted, arrested and accused, and the government was overthrown. The riots also broke out in the Sinai Desert. In Libya, the leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was killed following an 8-month civil war that witnessed foreign military intervention and the overthrow of the government. In Yemen, President Ali Abdullah Saleh was ousted and power was handed over to the government of national unity. In Syria, President Bashar al-Assad faced an internal uprising against his government, which turned into an armed insurgency and eventually a full-blown civil war. Civil uprisings also erupted in Bahrain. Large demonstrations spread in Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Maghreb, and Sudan, and minor protests occurred in Lebanon, Mauritania, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Western Sahara, and clashes occurred on the borders of Israel in May 2011. In Syria, the revolts were severely suppressed by the army, which caused some soldiers to flee and created the Free Syrian Army. They were quickly supported and armed, sometimes cautiously by the international community. Along with the regular Syrian army, Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were fighting. Both Shiites and allies of Bashar al-Assad. The conflict destabilized the country and allowed the entry of new Sunni jihadist and Salafi groups that quickly took over the revolution. Among them was Jabhat al-Nusra, a branch of al-Qaeda. From January 9 to January 16, 2011, a one-week independence referendum was held in the South Sudan Autonomous Region. Eventually, with a vote of more than 98%, Sudan was torn in two and the new country of South Sudan was formed. On December 15, 2011, the U.S. officially ended its military presence in Iraq by holding an official ceremony at Baghdad Airport in Baghdad's Green Zone, in the presence of the then Secretary of Defense. After the U.S. withdrawal, the insurgency in Iraq escalated. Sectarian violence continued in the first half of 2013. On July 1, 2013, an attack was carried out on Abu Ghraib prison. The assailants were able to escape at least 500 criminals, most of them senior members of al-Qaeda, who were sentenced to death. The attack began with a car bomb knocking on prison doors. In April 2013, the Islamic State in Iraq became the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, which included al-Nusra. But al-Qaeda refused to approve the new group. To be continued. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe my channel. May ALD.